On the premises, a man was gazing helplessly and was being chained accused of committing a crime. The higher members sentenced him to throw him into the Katarin dungeon, and the verdict was being read where the defendant was mentioned to be Kiska. The boy was yelling out to defend himself, saying that the accusation made against him was false and that he didn't do anything. The elder man ordered to take away Kiska, and then there were a few men around who were smirking while Kiska yelled out to spare him and mentioned he had been framed in the situation. The past of Kiska starts upon by at the Katari village, where he was born and raised, and the village had a S-rank dungeon called Katarov Dungeon, which had many adventurers crowded around that place. Here, Kiska was worked as a farmer where he sighs upon the ruined farm. He was then approached by the group of men which had Darga, the son of the head of village, along with his friends. Darga then calls out Kiska, saying that he heard upon having a poor harvest from Kiska, this time through his father. Kiska then trembles and thinks that he was the one who ruined his field, and that despite saying it out, Kiska apologizes. Kiska was known to be an alas. He was the person who had silver hair and were always prone to bullying, since there was a person in past who was an all and betrayed humans. Joining with the Darga then grows furious after Kiska apologized, punching him right in the face, throwing him to the ground, which also lead to him getting bullied and threatened by other of his friends, which Kiska couldn't defend but just to endure it. The then returns home all wounded and finds Namia, asked whether if he got bullied again by Darga, and then calls him to sit to treat his wounds. Namia was his childhood friend who was also a neighbor and was the only one close to him. Namia then asks as to why people didn't like him as he gets beaten up all the time, to which Kiska replies that he was helpless due to his silver hair. He found it disgusting. Namia then cheers him up, saying that his hair was cool, which makes Kiska happy since she was the only one to accept how he was. Namia then tells Kiska that she was going to marry Darga soon, which left him startled, and then congratulates her, which leaves her in shock. Namia then asks Kiska if he was okay with it, and then asks him if he was going to remain in this village forever, and states he shouldn't as she couldn't see him getting bullied and that he would be broken due to that. Kiska then hesitates and answers that he had no place to stay and that he couldn't do anything about him. Namia then holds Kiska's hands and suggests upon eloping, which shocks Kiska. She then tells that she had the savings left at her house which would be enough for them and using which they could run away from here. Kiska then asks if she was sure about it and she wasn't ready to marry someone like Darga, and then Kiska confesses that he loved Namia and kisses her, which she accepts she loved him too. Kiska brought all the items needed then, after which they would leave the village tonight. Kiska was happy and was rushing towards Namia's house where he heard Namia's screams as if she was struggling with something, which made Kiska tense. He rushed towards the door and found Namia getting assaulted by Darga and his friends, who left Kiska numb. Darga then questions Kiska why was he there, and Kiska trembles to ask what they are doing to Namia. He furiously punches Darga, who then ends up knocking Kiska along with his friends and torturing him by pinning him to the wall and snapping his fingernail off from his finger. Namia then yells not to hit Kiska and then reveals the planning they have done, after which Kiska starts to lose his consciousness and then sees Namia being held by her throat by Darga, and his sights fade away, seeing Namia crying in front of him. At the court, Kiska was being addressed as a sinner as he had been accused of taking advantage of Namia, which led to her death. Kiska stood lifelessly as he was being ordered to be sent to the Katarov dungeon. Kiska then thinks about how Namia was dead as Darga killed her upon learning the truth, despite which he was accused falsely of murdering Namia. The elder then continues the execution of Kiska and is thrown into the dungeon, where Kiska is overwhelmed by hate as Darga was the one to kill Namia and the villagers who weren't even ready to listen to his testimony. Kiska then wakes up to find himself in a huge space which is the S-rank dungeon, and he gets scared listening to the sounds of something approaching him and finds a huge monster-like creature which is a rank of bugbear, which frightens Kiska as he talks. He hears from the other adventurers that it would be hard for anyone to escape the monster and wouldn't be able to return home. The monster then starts chasing Kiska and gets attacked by it, leaving him trembling. He then yells out for help, and then a shady figure appears in front of him asking if he needs any help. The girl emerges from the figure, granting a skill to Kiska, which was to save and reset. Kiska was unaware of how he could use the skill to defeat the monster, and as he was thinking, he gets attacked by the monster and dies in an instant after its punch and the monster walk away from him. After a while, Kiska wakes up surprised, finding himself still alive despite the attack from the monster, and was still amazed on how he was alive rather than being dead. Kiska gasps as he finds himself alive even after being killed by the huge bugbear, since he was sentenced to be thrown in the S-rank dungeon due to the false accusation pinned upon him about the crime which was committed by Darga and his friends over killing Namia. Kiska then recalls that he was punched by the bugbear, which would have killed him. As he was still lost in that thought, the bugbear appeared behind him and punched him again, killing him the other time. Later, he finds himself revived again as he had come back to life and again gets punched by the monster, dying already there. This still keeps on continuing as he finds himself alive again the fourth time, and it proceeds until he notices that every time he dies, he is brought back to the moment before he dies, and he gets killed all the time he is revived. Despite his trials to escape death, he ends up being killed by the bugbear every time he faces it, which gives him immense pain of getting killed so many times, and pleads that he wants to be killed at once. He then gets alive again and thinks of turning off the skill, after which he would be freed from the loop of death, and he looks for the option to turn the skill off. As he touched the status bar, his memories started to flash regarding Namiya and others who killed and tricked him. He then gets fired up by rage and decides not to vanish simply like that without teaching them a lesson, and fights the bugbear but ends up dying as usual. And while fighting it, he strategizes the attacks bugbear did and then ends up knocking it off by his attack. He then runs along the way thinking how he could handle this situation and finds the hidden treasures in the dungeon, and seeing the monster approaching him, Kiska runs for his life and then falls into the trap and ends up dying. He then gets alive again and attacks the bugbear in its eyes and is aware of the traps he had the way along. He is successful in escaping the monster along with the trap, and then he proceeds to move towards the hidden room, where he travels the way, finds a huge room with a treasure chest placed in the center of the room, seeing which made him excited. He then opens the chest to find the Crystal of Wisdom, unlocking another skill, and then the list of skills appears in front of him, out of which he had to choose any of the one. He then tries to choose the skills of the S rank since he had no other options, and finally acquires the skill of Sleuth. Unfortunately, Kiska is surrounded by huge bugbear groups who are growling, and then approaches Kiska and he ends up getting killed by them again. As Kiska was surrounded by the group of bugbears, he ended up dying in the treasure chest room. Later, he wakes up finding himself back in the place where he firstly encountered the bugbear initially, and runs out yelling after he finds the bugbear behind him. He then reaches the chest room again and reselects his skill in such a way he can detect the bugbear's movements in slow motion. He then chooses the acceleration skill, despite which his hand gets broken since his body isn't able to withstand the strength, leading to him dying again in the room at the hands of the bugbears. He then finds himself back at the place where he encountered the bugbear for the first time, and then he is finally able to make up to the chest room despite so many killings he had to face to reach the hidden room, even though he tries many attempts not to get killed in the room by the bunch of bugbears. Kiska was let down and was dying every time he faced them. As he was about to give up hope on fighting the bugbears, he recalls Namiya and the incident which happened to her, which lead to a rage of hatred towards Daga and the other villagers, after which Kiska was determined to survive the situation and return to them to take revenge for what Name had faced. He then continues to battle against the bugbears and finally pounds upon the main bugbear, which leads to the monster's elimination, which improves his skill and continues fighting the rest of the monsters. But after seeing the count of the bugbears, he gives up on the thought of fighting them and ends up getting killed by them. He then reaches back to the chest room, overwhelmed by the feeling of failure as he wasn't able to escape the loop, as he wanted to teach a lesson to Darga and the villagers as his treat of revenge in his thoughts of pain. He then acquires the skill of Provoke, seemingly tired and almost hopeless whether if the skill would work. Though the bugbears appear around him, and as he directs his fingers toward them, provoking them to come near him, the bugbears get hit to the walls, knocking themselves down, which surprised Kiska upon how the skill worked. He then finally wipes out the gang of bugbears in the room around him and is happy upon his victory over them after so many attempts, over 500, and moves to conquer the treasures that spawn the other members of bugbears. Kiska runs fiercely away as he finds a headless horse-like creature chasing him through the path of the dungeon after he ends up beating the room full of bugbears, which leads to the exit and leads him to reach another room. This got him to encounter a new monster roaming on the floor, which was an rank headless mule that had already killed Kiska 10 times, where he was again respawned in the place where he defeated the bugbears. As he gets to escape the monster, he ends up exploring the floor and finds a room that has the teleportation circles on the ground, and Kiska thinks of trying to step on each one of them. He then gets teleported to a place in the dungeon and cautiously keeps going forward and finds a cell that has a girl captured and chained in it. Kiska then recalls the girl being the one to provide him with the skill earlier to fight the bugbear, and as he touched the glass of the cell, it cracked open and letting the girl out, who was unconscious for a while. She then wakes up telling Kiska that he had awoken her, and then introduces herself as Eija Tsubaki, who was an ex-hero and got sealed away here. Kiska then introduces himself to Eija, and then she asks him to bend down a little towards her and then kisses him, which surprises Kiska. He then pulls back, asking what she was doing. Eija then says that she wanted to thank him in that way and asks whether he didn't like it, which leaves him speechless. She then asks Kiska if he is planning to escape the place, and when he says yes, she grabs his hand and runs in the pathway of the dungeon, even killing the headless mule, seeing which Kiska was impressed. She then obtains a skill out of the killed monster and tells Kiska that she stores it in the item box skill. As they continue moving ahead, Eija informs Kiska that there is a room with the dungeon's mini-boss which they had to beat him to move forward, and assures she would fight for him. They then enter the room and find an S-rank golem, after which Eija tells Kiska to stay behind her, fighting all the attacks ahead, which impresses Kiska as to how strong she is. As she continues fighting the golem, she accidentally gets struck, which gets Kiska worried, and then he tries to provoke the attacks towards him to save Eija. He then ends up getting a huge fist towards him, which he dodges, where Eija thought he was killed due to lack of protection. Eija then strikes her using the sacred sword technique, Dragon Slayer breaking apart the golem, after which Aja happily pounds and hugs Kiska as they had defeated the mini-boss golem by themselves together. After they defeat the golem, Aja then sees through a burrow which she found, expecting an exit for them to get out of the dungeon. Aja then finds a secret room on the other side of the walls, seeing which Kiska is amazed. Aja then says that this would have been a place created by the vampire Judith, who made the dungeon her stronghold. Kiska then was worried whether their staying would make the vampires angry, to which she ignored the fact and rested herself on the huge bed and told Kiska that they would stay there for today, which left a bad feeling for Kiska about the place. She then calls Kiska to come and sit beside her, saying she had something to talk about with him. Kiska then asks Aja if he seems weird to her because of the silver hair he has, to which she says that it is pretty on him, which makes Kiska happy. He then tells her how it was a characteristic of the hated Arcus tribe and he was bullied due to it, except for Namia and Aja, who were the ones to compliment his hair. She then mentions that she belonged to a different world from him, and Kiska curiously stares at her since he never heard of something like that. Later assures her that he believed her when she told him. She then lies over his shoulder, which brings Kiska strange feelings of being close with her and thinks that she belongs to the other world might be the reason. Kiska's stomach starts growling, listening to which Aja gets ready to make food for him, and he then appreciates her, saying that the food is amazing, which makes her happy and excited to hear such a compliment from him. Kiska was grateful for having the food, as it had been a while since he struggled to find good food in such a dungeon and was lost in his thoughts about it. He then tells Aja that he will be going to sleep now and offers Aja to sleep on the bed and that he would sleep on the couch, despite which Aja insists there would be no problem if he sleeps with her, which he turns down. As they were sleeping, Kiska was still awake, thinking about how he had Aja's help and he could escape the dungeon through her, and felt useless as he was the one relying on her for everything, and as he thought of any other things. Aja asked up from her bed and comes upon Kiska, who was sleeping on the couch, and kisses him. This startles Kiska as he shockingly asks what she was doing, and then Aja was seducing him, and then confesses that she loved her, leaving him confused when this had happened. Aja then tells that he was the one to save her since she was sealed away deep in the dungeon for hundreds of years alone, believing that her prince would come to rescue her soon into the dungeon. Then she handed over the skill to the one who saved her, and this reminds Kiska of the skill she got while facing the bugbear, which was to save her from the dungeon. Aja then says that it was useless as the people whom she gave turned out to fail to reach her. Saying this, calling Kiska the prince, she starts to undress, which startles Kiska, who immediately yells out to stop, leaving her confused. Kiska then tells Aja that he isn't ready to do it with her as he loved someone else, even though Aja seems crazy about Kiska and pounds on him, kissing him, which leads to the flashing visions of Namia, and the incident that happened to her finds Aja to be in place of Darga as he was assaulting Namia. He then throws Aja away from him onto the ground and apologizes to her that he behaved that way. Aja then stands up and apologizes for her behavior of going beyond limits and returns to her bed. Kiska then lays back on his couch thinking about leaving these feelings behind. After he wakes up, he finds Aja standing near him, which confuses him. He then wakes up finding Aja near his couch, and then as he looks at the ceiling, he finds Aja hanging herself from the roof. This led Kiska to puke as he wasn't sure why this happened and thought he was the evil one here, since he was blaming himself for being the cause of her death as he rejected her last night. He then runs away from her hanging body out from the burrow and finds the headless mule alive, chasing him by the groups and killing him again. He then respawns in the location of the room where he defeated the bugbears. He then feels guilty, thinking he was the reason for her death, and then thinks accepting her would have kept her alive. He then recalls Namia as his girlfriend and still finds someone like Aja sealed in the chamber, seeing which he decides to accept her love this time and frees her from the chamber. Aja then wakes up and looks at Kiska as a new person questions him as a stranger and that she never knew anyone named Kiska. She then points out how he smells bad, and then Kiska figures out that this girl seems different than Aja. He then calls her Aja, then she remembers that it was not the first time he met her. She then recalls that he was the one who went against her the last time, which Kiska kept on denying. Aja then chokes Kiska, holding him by the neck seemingly with an evil glare, and tells him that he could get back his mistakes normal every time he dies and that his actions would reach his soul later. Kiska struggles and asks the girl to let him talk to Aja as he knows she isn't one to talk in this way to him. The girl refuses and arms not to ever get involved with Aja, and then she snaps Kiska's neck, killing him. This led to his respawn in the room earlier, and he then thinks not to return to her now since he couldn't be able to break the seal later. As he walked through the paths, he had to hide from the monsters on the floor, and then he reached the teleport room where he chose the other circle. He then got teleported to the same looking pathway which led him to Aja. And as he walks by, he finds a girl having a cup of tea, who then looks at Kiska, surprised to see an intruder in the dungeon. Kiska then wonders who this girl is and what she is doing relaxing within a hellish dungeon. Kiska then tells her that he was looking for a way out of the dungeon to escape. Sun then the girl states it was rude of him and reveals that she was the great ancestor of the vampires and cuts over her wrist, which shocks Kiska. She then gets up from her seat moving towards Kiska, where the cut had a weapon emerges and pierces through Kiska's chest. The girl turned at him with an evil grin, saying that this was the sin her committed for his death. This ends him back in the room where he is traumatized by seeing many bad people occupying the dungeon. Kiska wakes up finding himself dead the previous time when he encountered the vampire whom Aja spoke to him about, and confirms that she was the one to kill him in the dungeon, who was none other than the true ancestor of vampires, Judith. He first found out Judith to be an innocent girl who was dressed up in cute clothes at his first meet with her and doesn't think of fighting her, the one who attacked him for no reason. He then runs through the routes of the dungeon to reach the teleportation circles. Kiska then gets teleported as he steps over the second route and walks through the way, hoping he won't face any other people like Ajaha and Judith like before he did when he went into the other routes. He then finds a suspicious sword in the middle of the pathway which seemed huge and powerful, and wonders upon how he could use the weapon since he had been weaponless, as it seemed powerful enough to use to fight against any enemies he would face, thinking it might help to get him out of the dungeon. As he gets hold of the sword, Kiska experiences a shooting pain all through his body after he grabbed the sword, and he couldn't let the sword leave his hand as if it was stuck to him. Later, Kiska passes out by the pain and wakes up finding himself fainted at the teleportation region and finding that his right hand was replaced by the sword he found before, and was terrified looking at it. He then kept his arm dragging since the sword was heavy and holding him back while walking, making him tired. As he was walking along the way, he encountered the demon of a rank, a werewolf, which was approaching Kiska, fiercely roaring at him. He was about to step back seeing the monster, but the sword drew him towards the monster as if with a huge force without Kiska's control over it, and ending up stabbing the werewolf and killing it. This shocked Kiska as he effortlessly ended up killing the monster, thinking the sword would have control of its own, and he proceeded to fight against all the monsters fearlessly which he encountered all along his path. Kiska then stands out at the room as he reaches the gate, where he thinks that it would be the room of the mini-boss, where he wonders if he has to face the same enemy he did the last time. As he opened the door, he found a huge bird-like creature sitting in between the hallway, which was the S-rank griffin in the room, which seemed to be stronger and bulkier than Kiska and flew towards him in no time, and then Kiska dodged its attack and gets prepared for its next attack, where he strategizes on fighting it and ends up beheading the griffin's head. He then gets confident over fighting his enemies as he gets the power of the black parasitic sword. He then finds a hidden door in the room as he found with the golem. He then enters the room with the thought of getting out of the dungeon after he learns how to use the sword all along the way. He then walks through the way dragging his hand, which was attached by the sword, and that starts to spread all through his shoulder, which makes Kiska feel more fatigued and makes him think something is wrong with him since he feels the sword getting heavier over him. He then continues struggling to walk along with the sword and finds a girl ahead of him who then sees Kiska, who then taunts him saying he had grown up much than before when she saw him the last time, which startles Kiska. He then finds that it is Judith, who appeared out of nowhere, startling him by standing in front of him, and he then in a terrified tone questions why she is here. Kiska then starts yelling at Judith as to what she wants from him now. Judith then smirks, asking if he is still under the control of the parasite, and says that she wants to dispose of the part of him this reason, which was to destroy the parasitic sword on the right half of his body, which leaves Kiska shocked. Judith then mentions the sword being a puppet parasitic sword that grew by feeding on people and even monsters. She says that she left the sword as it was since the dungeon was rarely visited by humans, and she didn't expect this to happen with someone like Kiska. He then questions Judith whether she is going to kill him now, and then she answers his question to what he asked by ripping off her right arm, leaving Kiska shocked as she did rip her arm off, which turned to be a deadly weapon. The arm then turns to be a sword, and Judith then smug looking at Kiska, telling him to die. As she pounded towards him, Kiska's arm sword resisted the attack of her sword. Judith was then thrown away from Kiska, which seemed to be a tough task for her to fight against the parasitic sword Kiska had. She then threw her weapon into the air, leaving it to transform into a shallow rainstorm of blades that burst upon Kiska, piercing throughout his body, which ended up killing him. This led to him being respawned back to the room and finds himself in a helpless position where he recalls all the events he had gone through previously after encountering Judith after getting controlled by the parasitic sword, and thinks of visiting the teleportation ports to enter any of the situations since he had encountered all of them, where the first one would lead him to the sealed Ajah's location, and secondly, he would reach the place where he would encounter Judith and getting himself killed without warning, and thirdly was the parasitic sword where he was brutally attacked by Judith by her blasts of the weapon she had. After thinking a lot about picking out a way, he then plans to enter the third teleportation route and decides to kill the vampire Judith with the help of the parasitic sword by being its puppet, thinking it would eventually let him out of the dungeon. He then recalls the words Judith said before he planned to attack her, that the parasitic sword feeds on humans and grows by feeding on the monsters, and plans to grow the full potential of the sword, which would help him to beat Judith with that power. He then finds the sword on the way and gets to enter the third teleportation sword. After he got teleported, he remained cautious whether Judith would be appeared suddenly and checked around. Then he entered a room that led ahead to Judith previously and ended up finding a pack of werewolves. Seeing which, Kiska smirked as it was beneficial for him. He could feed the parasitic sword on all the monsters to fight Judith later since he would get powerful then. Judith then enters the room to find Kiska has fed the sword, which is much of a monster, and turned his body into half a monster, which also had his consciousness taken over by the parasite. Judith then ends up killing Kiska once again, and before which she challenges Kiska to fight over her once again after he returns to her after being respawned. Kiska then wakes up after respawning and is still worried as he can't win over Judith despite him having the parasitic sword and feeding the sword to the monsters to fight against her powers, even though knowing all the routes that led him to the place through teleportation. Now he plans to visit the second teleportation route, which was the way to meet Judith directly, where he previously ended up getting killed unknowingly by her. After he reached the place of his will through teleportation, Judith was surprised to see Kiska as he chose the route to meet her even though there were other routes. Kiska then decides to escape death from Judith by respectfully kneeling to Judith, even before she has thoughts of killing him for being rude to her like what happened previously the first time. He states that he would presume her to be the great Judith, the ancestor of the vampires, and makes an effort in asking Judith a favor he had, which was to make Kiska her disciple, which surprises Judith. Thanks for watching.